Welcome to Through the Trauma podcast. My name is Amber Larkins, published photographer, storytelling expert, visual artist, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach. This podcast was born from one question: how do I get inspiring stories of triumph out to the people who need to hear them the most? Come with me, enter my world, where lives are getting changed, heroes are getting developed, and greatness is being achieved. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Through the Trauma podcast. I am Amber Larkins, your host, and today I have with me Miss Jill Sitnick. Jill is an award-winning strategic thinker and educator who has healed her childhood trauma-induced PTSD with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. She has over 25 years of educational technology expertise, having worked with Microsoft and Amazon. Jill is very knowledgeable when it comes to using psychedelics to heal, and she's got her own story she's going to share with us today, among many other resources. So, Jill, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with our audience today.
Amber, thank you so much for having me. I think we're going to have a great conversation.
Yes, I can't wait. This has been a much anticipated episode ever since I booked your time to record. So, I'm very interested to learn more about this, and I know that can be a very taboo subject to jump on and to talk about, but we're all about learning. So I'm looking to you. I really want to learn from you. I want you to share with us your honest opinion and the way that this has helped you, and I hope that other people will find the help that they need from some of the strategies and things that you've done.
I'm right there with you. That's why I'm having these kind of conversations. So looking forward to answering the questions.
Why don't you start by kind of sharing with us what even sparked your curiosity with this modality of healing?
Well, it was a little worse than curiosity. It was a multi-month panic attack that would not go away 18 months after my long-term partner, Carl, had passed away. I was doing everything right. I was 18 months into my grieving and healing, and everything on the surface looked great. I got a work email that deserved a stress level of about a 1, and I went to a 10. My physical system was all out of sorts. My stomach was upset. My shoulders were up to my ears. I started not sleeping. I was absolutely sure that this work email that involved certifications was going to lead to me losing my job, never being able to get another job, losing my house, living in my car with my pets. I mean, I went in about 10 seconds from a secure place to a very panicked, oh my gosh, the universe is kind of just going to destroy me. And, it was irrational. Like 95% of my body was saying, there's a problem here. And the other 5% was like, wait a minute, I had the rug pulled out from me when I was a child. I have like plan B, C, D, and E in place. This isn't going to happen. And I could not calm my body down. I went back to my therapist who had helped me with my grief work. And after a couple of months of not being able to get rid of this physicality, this fear, she diagnosed me with PTSD from my childhood stuff, because it was the first time we'd actually talked about my childhood stuff. And it turns out that she was in a program to become a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist. And so she said to me, look, go check out MAPS.org, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They have, at the time, they had their second clinical trial phase. And I probably messed that up because I'm not a doctor, but they already had research establishing that MDMA, which is an empathogen psychedelic, can greatly impact the healing of PTSD. And so it wasn't necessarily curiosity, it was desperation at that point, because I didn't see any other way around it. I had already tried Wellbutrin, I had clearly tried talk therapy, and there was no reason in my modern life for this level of fear. And I was I shouldn't say becoming, I even hate to admit it now, but I was borderline suicidal. I did not want to continue living that way. So that's kind of how I got here in a nutshell.
Mm. Yeah, which is, I mean, we all struggle with some level of trauma or toxicity or like something in our life that can push us to these levels. Like that's part of the human experience. I feel like that we go through these things. It's learning it's finding the right thing that can help us through those situations and then learning how to cope and manage those things. So when you look
Yeah.
back at the therapy that you did, do you feel like that was the thing that has really pushed you into healing from that type of trauma?
Oh, absolutely. So much so that I went ahead and I wrote a memoir detailing my experience that takes the reader along with me. I tried as much as possible to not have 2020 hindsight kind of talking, that I really showed the ups and downs and the one step forward, three steps back sometimes process. And I wrote a workbook that simulates the prompting that my therapist and I did when I got prepared for the journeys. I was after a year, so my therapy to then no longer qualify for PTSD diagnosis was over the course of a year, 3 psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy sessions, 2 of which with just MDMA, the third one with MDMA with a tiny bit of psilocybin or magic mushrooms. And after that year, when I no longer qualified for the diagnosis, meaning I was no longer suicidal. I had dealt with a lot of what I call the capital T traumas. I still had some capital T traumas and some little t traumas to heal. I now know hindsight 2020. But at the end of that year, from September to the following September, I was no longer suicidal. I knew there was a future, and I felt differently than I had probably felt any other time in my life. Meaning, this was something that actually worked with my brain to make me feel better. I was able to have a completely different perspective. It was not the universe that was after me the way that my toddler brain thought when her 200 and some pound, 6'2" father was beating her up. Uh-uh. It was my father. And being able to reframe from an adult perspective many of those capital T traumas from when I was a child is what ultimately led me to realize the universe is not against me. There's no reason to be suicidal. I'm not running a race I cannot win. This therapy, in my opinion, it saved my life. I don't know if there would have been anything else. And because it was so positive. Now, was it easy? No. Healing, I think in the book, I might talk about crying like 10 million times. I mean, this was hard stuff, but there is another side. And that's why I was so motivated to write the book, write the workbook, and start talking on podcasts like this, because psychedelics have such a stigma. I had such a stigma in my mind when my therapist mentioned it. I was like, "Oh, there's too much neon in the room right now." Like I started to joke around because I didn't have any experience with it, and so I want to be the voice that says this therapy can work. Is it hard work? Yes. Is it a magic pill? No. But if you put in the work and you're willing to kind of go through the fire a little bit, is sometimes the way I say it. It's a valid healing modality.
Did you have other types of treatment before you got into this treatment? So I know, and I think you and I had a talk previous to this call, this particular recording, where we had talked about you were kind of shocked by the PTSD diagnosis.
Look, I was adulting well. I had a amazing job in big tech. My house was good. The pets were fed. I was in a relationship. Everything looked fine. I just always thought I was a super anxious type A kind of person. It didn't even occur to me that I had PTSD. I'm Generation X. We grew up without parents. Like that's just the way I grew up. I had no idea. So yeah, I totally fought back. And one of the reasons why I didn't have talk therapy through most of my I had some talk therapy when I was younger to deal with like my mother's suicides and things like that. But as an adult, I didn't, primarily because I saw the lack of success it had with my mother. My mother was clinically depressed her entire life on various medications, and I did not really trust talk therapy. It
Mhm.
was a delight that my therapist was able to help me through the grieving process. And when she diagnosed me with PTSD, yeah, I fought it. I was like, no, 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 come on, have you met me? And then she had me read The Body Keeps the Score, which
Mhm.
explained how trauma is actually in our bodies. And it was like turning on the light for me. I was like, oh my gosh, this is me. But that's I argued with her. I had to read a book to believe her about my diagnosis.
Mhm. So when you were diagnosed with the PTSD, that's when you started therapy? You didn't have therapy before that?
Not psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, no.
Talk therapy?
The talk therapy, the reason why I was able to go back to my therapist is that after my partner Carl passed away, about 3 or 4 months after he passed away, I started seeing my therapist to help me with the grief work because I actually said to myself, I was treating myself. I was treating myself to have someone to be able to share all of that emotion with and to give me some perspective and to even validate that the look, I'm starting to tear up, that the valid that to validate that the emotions with grief are natural and the process takes time. And so that's
Mhm.
originally how I met my therapist, and that was pure talk therapy.
Gotcha. So yeah, that makes sense. So this is what is actually so beautiful about your story is that you went for one thing and then you found out that you're struggling with more. um, which leads us into the your therapist was recommended this type of therapy to try this therapy, and you found major success not only with the grief, but you've also found success with childhood trauma and other types of trauma, and now you are living your best life as a result of this. So I want to dive into a little bit about that therapy and what that's like, because I know this is probably a foreign thing for a lot of my listeners. Maybe not, but it's a foreign thing to me, and I'm very curious about it. So I would love to dive into that a little bit more. Like, what does that actually look like? And then, what was your reaction to going into? You're talked into
Mhm.
to doing this. Was it scary? Was it, did your I have so many questions, but let's start with one at a time.
And I will validate for you that all of the questions are the questions I get all the time. So you're right on track. It's one of the reasons why I'm here chatting about it. So let me see. What is an MDMA journey like? So first of all, to be completely candid, the street name for MDMA is ecstasy. In my case, I had what I consider medical grade MDMA, meaning that I know it came without anything else in it, is what I'll say. MDMA is an empathogen versus a traditional psychedelic. And what that means is that I didn't get any fancy neon visuals while in my MDMA therapeutic journey. Instead, for trauma victims, and that's all I can speak to because I never really used it recreationally. So as a trauma victim, the day that I went for my therapeutic journey with my therapist and a guide who was a medical doctor. So I had two people in the room with me during the entire process. I went in with intentions. What did I want to heal? For me, it was all about fear. I wanted to stop believing that the universe was out to get me because it very clearly hadn't been if you looked at my life, but I needed to feel that difference. When I took the capsules, there were two capsules, what I first noticed was a calmness. And I always do this because I think I lived my entire life with my shoulders up to my ears. My body calmed down. The flight and fright kind of process in the body when you are scared was dimmed. The very first thing was that for probably the first time in my life, I heard my internal inner voice. That was one thing. The second thing was that for the first time in my life, I bluntly told my guide and therapist that if my father was in the room at that moment, he would have his hands around my neck, the way that he had his hands around my mother's neck at a parent conference meeting when I was in elementary school. And I remember vehemently trying to explain to them just how dangerous this man was to me. I don't know if he was dangerous to anybody else. And there was some ensuing conversation. The journey for me, my first journey was about 5 hours, and it alternated between chatting, because I think you can tell I'm a chatty person, and other times, one of the phrasings that you'll hear with psychedelics is that the medicine, because in this instance, this was a medical procedure, the MDMA was the medicine for me. What you get is um, times where I'm chatty and times where I want to put an eye mask on and I just want to rest. And I always kind of joke around that the medicine was just marinating in my brain to find the traumas that I needed to deal with the intention of how do I stop being afraid of the universe. Now, my first journey, I was a very guarded person. I was, in my late 40s. I lived my entire life being very, very careful. And, I jumped out of the journey at like hour number 5, which is the great way to know if your patient or somebody going through this therapy is super, super guarded. But even with that, within an hour after the end of that journey, and this is important to understand because I got out of the journey, I was very aware that I snapped out of it. My doctor and guide talked to me about it. And I thought, oh, I failed. I didn't do a good job. This didn't work. And I was kind of crying. But an hour after the journey, my boyfriend at the time was driving me home. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying, oh my gosh, I'm such an inconvenience. I can't believe I had to ask for this. And I was just going on and on and on in my mind. I was quiet. I wasn't voicing it. And here's where the healing happens. I suddenly had two or three, I forget now how many, two or three childhood memories of where I was perceived as an inconvenience. My parents shuffled me around. I was ignored very often on weekends. There was never really any money. I internalized that behavior as I'm an inconvenience and I shouldn't be an inconvenience. People won't like me if I'm an inconvenience. So I had those memories. And then my internal voice said, is it really true that you were an inconvenience? Or was it that your parents just really weren't good at parenting or kind of living life in general? And I was like, yeah, you're right. I really wasn't an inconvenience. I was just a kid that like needed to eat. And hey, maybe I'm really not an inconvenience to people. That's how it worked. That quickly, I knew how the process was going to work. And the days, the weeks, the months after that psychedelic assisted psychotherapy session, that's how it happened. I would have memories come up. My inner voice would talk to me. I was able to look at my childhood from the different perspective. And when I could no longer do that, but my body was still in fight or flight, that's how I knew I was ready for another journey.
I mean, that's a beautiful description of how that works, and this is something that I've wondered when people talk about psychedelic therapy or MDMA therapy. I
Yeah.
don't fully understand how that works, and I've often said not really from a knowledgeable space, but just from the space of like you have these two opposing things, right? You have drug usage, people that recreationally use drugs. And then you
Yep.
have this space of under a physician, like they're monitoring and managing everything. And then also, I would think, but I don't know this, they're coaxing you through this in a way because you're being guided through it by with therapists or people who know how to.
No, no, no. You're totally on track with how everybody. That's more of a traditional talk therapy, which is the only thing we really know. So that's a natural conclusion. When the majority of the time, a therapist and a guide or two practitioners, they are primarily guiding the patient when there is something that the patient says that could be dangerous, a dangerous way of thinking, a block, a negative block. My first journey, I was 1,000% sure that I never should have been born. I never should have been on this earth. And my guide gently guided me or pushed me against that. But one of the jokes that my therapist likes to kind of talk about, she's lovely. A lot of what your guide and your therapist are doing during the session is they're going, they're just intently listening because it's really the patient that is unfolding. And the people I worked with are very much aware, they following different protocols, very much aware that my subconscious was kind of wide open, and they don't want to guide. They don't want to direct. It's not their role to impose their opinions on my subconscious. Their role is to guide gently if they hear something dangerous, but other than that, to listen intently.
So then
And
this
and
leads
be a
me.
support. Keep the space safe. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I
No,
apologize.
you're
To
fine.
keep the space nice and safe for the person.
Yeah. So then this leads me to another question here, which is what keeps someone from just saying, "Hey, you know what? I'm hearing of all this therapy with MDMA, and why don't I just go buy some ecstasy and I'll do some self-soothing therapy at home?" Like, this is an underlying question I'm
Mhm.
sure a lot of people are asking, especially people that have done ecstasy in the past.
It totally makes sense. And depending on what forum you're on, if you check out some of the internet forums, you'll see that there's a huge population of people who have partaken in psychedelics for mental health. I mean, before the war on drugs, this research was going on, and then it got shut down with the war on drugs, and then it kind of resurfaced. But there's an underground of people who have been doing this work. To answer your question directly, this is my opinion. I'm giving my opinion at this point. My level of trauma, I would not have been successful if I didn't have the space being held safely by two people that I trusted immensely. And even though I trusted my therapist, I had a multi-year relationship with her, even then, my first journey was still very closed. So, my caution is if you're someone like me, with my mother attempted suicide multiple times. I was beaten regularly by my father. I went to about 13 different schools before I graduated. I was thrown out of both of my parents' homes. I was on my own at 19. There's a lot of stuff there, and I would caution to wait until the therapy is thoroughly available. Right now, MAPS just put in their NDA, which I forget what that's called, but it's like the FDA application. So we're anticipating this therapy is going to be approved in 2024, and then the DEA will go ahead and reschedule MDMA. I know I got a lot of letters going on there. So if you're someone like me who deep trauma and you know it, I would say find qualified people to work with and obviously wait until it's available. If you're someone with a lower T trauma, you know something's up, but you think it's like a one-off, you're going to hear stories on internet forums all the time of people healing that. And I would say, too, if you're someone who's thinking of doing that, it's one of the reasons why I wrote the workbook to kind of help you at least get the foundation of how to kind of get started, how to think about it, what intentions are, what integrations is. And there are a number of books that you can find that go into much more detail. So I would just encourage people to do their research and gauge their level of trauma before they dive in on their own. That's my advice. I'm not a doctor. I'm just someone who went through the therapy.
Yeah, and that totally makes sense. For you mentioned something earlier I thought was probably profound in that you don't know what's in these street drugs. So someone could have put something else in there that could cause addiction, could cause more trauma. You don't
Right.
really know. So working with someone who is qualified is probably better too. My
Yeah.
concern, obviously doing this podcast, I want to bring people the best resources and help them find the thing that's going to help them heal and be their best
Yeah.
self. But I
Yeah.
don't want to bring misinformation. So I think it's valuable to say too, like, these are the reasons why. But it's been a valid question that I've had as I've
Yeah.
talked to other people and had it brought up by other guests on the podcast. What's the advantage? I think you did a great job explaining that. And from your experience, I think that's very valuable for people to know that if I go through this, knowing that I have someone right there kind of leading me, guiding me, plus you're in a safe environment. If anything were to happen, you're right there with qualified individuals.
Absolutely. With two sober people who are not in an enhanced state, who can easily call 911 if there's an issue. MDMA is a stimulant, so you don't want to have caffeine. Uh, I'm not going to give advice about that stuff. People can go ahead and research. One of the other reasons, though, I mean, my healing was primarily MDMA. But you and I both know that the folks are heading down to Peru, they're heading down to other countries, and they're going to retreats to start their own healing process, usually with psilocybin magic mushrooms. And if you're one of those people, that's again why I wrote the workbook, to kind of give a foundation to help you get started.
I really don't know anything about that. One day, maybe I'll get someone on the show to talk more about these retreats and things because, I don't know anything about it, but it's very curious. But I have heard of this type of therapy, and I have heard a lot of success stories with it. I think it's something that should be explored. I'm all for find what works for you. And if someone's listening that is curious, like I would recommend research these things because this might be the help that you need. And especially when you're like Jill, you held in a lot of trauma from childhood. It's trauma that's stacked. So it's trauma that's stacked on
Yes.
other trauma, that's stacked on other trauma. But I think the longer you carry that trauma too, the more detrimental it can be because that can start to domino.
One thing, just a couple of things to help your listeners with everything you just said,
Mhm.
because you're right on track. If you want to learn more about how the war on drugs started, check out Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. It's a comprehensive book on psychedelics and tells a lovely story that I'm terrible at recounting. So check that out. Secondly, uh, because I'm in this space and I follow all this information, if you do a simple search on LinkedIn, of all places, you will see how even the government is starting to fund, is working to, because forgive me with where they are with the bills and all that kind of stuff, to fund additional research into psychedelics for specifically veterans. In my mind, it is a tragedy that it hasn't been opened up for veterans way sooner. So this is not just a Jill one-off. Again, the FDA is set to approve this therapy in 2024. So we're on the path to being able to help millions of people. I think on average, uh, 5 to 6% of the population has suffered or does suffer from PTSD. So it's a huge population. And so I just wanted to make sure that I covered that.
In your perception of things, what is the difference between this and a pharmaceutical drug that would be prescribed for, say, PTSD?
The only pharmaceutical I was ever prescribed was about a year after Carl's passing, and I was very low. I was very low. I personally think the first year of losing someone is awful, but I think the second year is worse. Because the first year, I was still really deeply in the widow's fog. And as the widow's fog starts to dissipate, it's just so clear that that person is not there. And at that point, I had a low dose prescription of Wellbutrin. And I don't really know much about Wellbutrin. What it did for me was it just kind of numbed everything. I think in some ways for me, it almost prolonged the widow's fog. It kind of made, it just took the edge off, but I still had the grief. And as a matter of fact, when I was getting ready for the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy session, I had to be completely off of Wellbutrin. So I had to taper that off. in my limited experience, because that's my only experience, about 6 months, 6-ish months, I never hear people talking about antidepressants or SSRIs as, hey, I was only on it for X amount of time and then I felt better or I was healed or it helped me with whatever. I hear people being on those things long term. In my instance, and one of the things that the insurance companies are kind of struggling with right now, I had 3 sessions over the course of a year, in addition to maybe every other week, a talk therapy session with my therapist to help me with integration. 1 year to no longer qualify for a PTSD diagnosis versus ongoing prescriptions. Some people talk about being on prescriptions for 5, 10, 15 years. So I don't know how long I would have been on Wellbutrin, to be honest. I just know that Wellbutrin in no way, shape, or form was the right pharmaceutical for me to help PTSD. And it wasn't prescribed for that. It was prescribed for depression with the grief, to be honest. But I don't really know if there is a pharmaceutical specifically for PTSD, which is, I think, why this therapy is just an absolute amazing thing to help millions of people.
Mhm.
You
Yeah,
know,
and I'm not a huge fan of the pharmaceutical industry. I believe it has its place, but I don't believe that I believe the system is broken when you put someone on a medication and it's long term and they're going to be on it forever. Because our
yeah.
bodies are resilient and I think they're made to heal themselves. And so I was just curious kind of how this stood up, but you answered that perfectly because, anything that you can do this, once or twice or a few times, and it puts your body on the trajectory of healing is why not
Right.
try that? Because every time you take a pharmaceutical drug, you're introducing side effects to
Yeah,
everything. You don't take a drug that's not going to have some type of side effects. So,
it's true.
right now, this is not legal to do within the states. If someone
Right.
wanted to embark on this type of therapy, they would have to either wait on it to be legalized here in the states, or they would have to go somewhere outside of the states to do it.
It was just approved in Australia in the summer, and Australia is working on the rollout. And there's probably a better word than rollout. What it seems to be is that it's not like you and I can get diagnosed with PTSD and then go to a pharmacy and get MDMA. It's probably going to be that doctors can access the medication for patients that qualify. And so that's what kind of Australia is working through. There are countries where MDMA is legal and you don't hear horror stories and all the kind of all the stereotypes of when I was a child of the egg in the frying pan. You don't hear all that. I do have resources on my website, thejourneysage.com. Most of the resources are for retreats that you can search and you can see if that retreat is going to help you with what you need to do. I haven't been to them. I can't say whether they're good or bad or whatever. I know people are looking for different solutions, and I've just been aggregating resources to help them. It'll be, I would say, in maybe 2 or 3 years, the US will be really ready to go with it. Because right now we're also working on, not we, but I know that training practitioners in this particular modality is something that has to be done. You can't just say, oh, this is legal and not have any sort of requirement for a practitioner. So that's being worked on. Like, we're very much in the early stages here. People can check out my website to see what other resources are around. And there are internet talk forums. You'll be surprised what you can find when you actually start looking, is what I'll say.
Mhm. You offer a lot of
Yeah.
resources, but I'm curious if, say, someone didn't have the ability to go overseas to get treated with this, is there ways that they can find other communities?
Amber, you're skating on thin ice right now.
Okay.
This is this has absolutely been underground. My experience was underground. My doctors were connected and knew the MAP protocols, and I felt very confident in the credentials of the people with whom I worked. Is there absolutely an underground Yes, and I don't want to
community.
even begin to get anybody in trouble, so I'm not going to say
Right,
anything.
right.
But what I will say is that when you start looking and you start investigating different forms, I mean, heck, you can even go to Meetup and find psychedelic communities. You can go to Reddit. You can even go to Facebook, believe it or not. Do not buy anything off of Instagram or Facebook. Do not do that. But you can absolutely start to find resources. I wish I could clone my doctor and my guide, because I get people on a weekly basis reaching out to me. And of course, I can't, I'm not in that position right now to share that information. But if you're someone like me who is functioning and isn't suicidal, but knows that you have some pretty heavy trauma to deal with, if you can continue talk therapy for another year or so, the therapy is going to be available unless something completely goes off the rails. Right now, it looks like it's going to be available in the US.
I want people to find the help that they need.
Yes.
And when there's restrictions on that
Yes.
help, it makes it so hard. But I get it too. I do
Yes.
understand that, you don't want to just release something into the public where people are then just misusing it. And it's unfortunate, but that is human nature. You're going to have some people that, if there has to be regulations, and I get that.
Yeah, it's a
So,
stimulant. I
mhm.
mean, there was a very clear dosage according to my weight, and according to a number of hours in. I mean, this is a medicine that, the same way when you go to the pharmacy and you get the instructions, I personally think as long as people are following those instructions, they're fine. We do know there's that 1 or 2% that aren't going to read anything and do silly stuff, but most people like me, most people like me, high performers, super anxious, really wanting to heal, we're going to pay attention to that stuff, which is what I did at the time. And again, working with qualified people made me feel a lot more comfortable. I went into my first journey completely terrified. I had no idea what psychedelics were, what they were going to do. And one of the reasons why I talk about it now before it's FDA approved is to help make sure it gets FDA approved. There are too many stories of people who, whether they're made up or not, you know, um, the person who jumped off of a balcony, the person who drove a car and did something, all these kind of crazy stories. And everybody goes, oh my gosh, psychedelics. And nobody turns around and says, well, what else was in their system? What was their dosage? What was their state of mind before they took it? All the same questions we would ask somebody around drinking. How much did they drink? Were they upset beforehand? Did they make a poor decision? Those are all the questions that should go into any story you hear about psychedelics. We just haven't been trained that way. We've just been trained that, oh, psychedelics are bad no matter what. I wanted my voice to be a strong advocate that MDMA in a therapeutic environment it's I can't even come up with the word. It's groundbreaking. It's transformational. I'm still here, and I'm not 100% sure I would still be here if I didn't have this therapy. And
Mhm.
so I know it's frustrating that it's not available yet, but more voices need to be heard to make sure it does become available. And that's why I'm
Mhm.
here. And that's why I'm so thrilled that you're kind of letting me have this conversation with you.
Well, I'm all for it too. And I think to myself, like, there's just like you said, with drinking or with pharmaceutical drugs. You put pharmaceutical drugs out there, people misuse those. Pain pills. There's a huge epidemic in our nation with pain pill usage. And it's like,
Right.
maybe there needs to be regulations on that. But what frustrates me, I think, the most about something like this is that it is helping people, and people don't have access to it. So it makes it really hard.
Yet, yet,
Yet. So that leads me
your
to my
podcast
next.
is one of the front runners.
So this leads me to my next question, which is, what can we do as someone who is, empathetic or sympathetic, and we see people struggling, or we are one of those people that are struggling. what can we do to assist this getting approved faster? Is there anything we can do?
Um, so the FDA, so all of the research from the phase 3 clinical trials, the trials have been going on for quite a number of years. You can go to the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies and click on PTSD, because they're actually studying a variety of mental disorders or mental issues with psychedelics. I just happen to have healed with my PTSD, but there's a bunch of stuff. It just showed up within the last week or so. I'm actually going to be doing a video on it soon to fully explain it. That the FDA has gotten all the data. The FDA is going to look at all the data, and they are legally required, as long as the data proves that this modality works, they are legally required to approve. And then, as I understand it, the DEA needs to reschedule MDMA to not be a Schedule 1 drug. I don't know what they reschedule it to make it so that it can be prescribed. Then there needs to be a supply line, and there needs to be groups that are able to perform this therapy. And then insurance needs to figure out what they're going to reimburse for and how they're going to reimburse, because an 8-hour day with 2 practitioners, that gets a little pricey. So I would say for folks who understand this modality can work, just kind of pay attention to the news when the crazy headlines come up. Like there was just one about the pilot with magic mushrooms that was totally not true whatsoever, but there was a headline about it. So, oh my gosh, psychedelics are bad. Meanwhile, everybody who has had a magic mushroom journey was like, yeah, no, it's not possible. I would just say kind of keep your mind open and don't immediately believe the clickbait media, but pay attention to the MAPS website for their updates. There are a number of reputable places on LinkedIn that are following this tremendously. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll immediately see who's posting good information that can keep you up to date. We're not at the point of having to write into anybody. We're not at that point. We're just at the point of making sure that the media doesn't tank this in some way, shape, or form by just being so negative, because that's what they're used to. And negative articles encourage more clicks. Let's be honest. Somebody talking about a pilot on magic mushrooms versus Jill healing her PTSD, which one's going to get more clicks? So I would just say, get a little bit more informed about this, because I guarantee everyone knows someone, whether it be a close relative or an extended relative or a friend, who has suffered or is suffering from PTSD. And so let's be an advocate for those people.
Mm. So basically, what you're saying is use your voice, research these things, learn about them, and then use your voice to remove the stigma, because this is a big thing with mental health. A big reason that I had, I wanted to even start the podcast is because there's so much of a stigma around mental health and around the modalities that go with mental
Yes.
health and around everything. People are ashamed to talk about it. And it's like we have to use our voice. We have to use our voice to speak and to raise awareness. And if we're not doing that, then we're leaving hurt and pain and shame and all the things on the table, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of those that we love, and just people in general, the public. I mean, it's a domino effect that happens in the world when you have hurt people. You've heard the thing of hurt people hurt people. It's like, let's go on this mission to heal people, to make people better, so that we're not hurting each other. We're actually loving each other. Real kind of love, not just like socially acceptable things, but really loving someone to the point that wanting to see them be their very best self. So I think it's wonderful that you're using your voice to bring awareness to this. Thank you. Thank you. I think it's great you're using your voice for this, Jill.
Yeah, I couldn't have summarized it any better. Hurt people hurt others. If we can stop generational trauma, if we can heal people and change, my mother's life, my life, if I had had this therapy when I was in my 20s, my life could have been radically different. My mother's life, like this is life-changing stuff. So yeah, but you said it much better than I did. That's why you
Oh,
have this podcast.
oh, thank you. I just love people and I want to see people get healed, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think, bringing people on like yourself who can raise awareness to these things and remove the stigma. That's the thing, because we're all different, we're all individuals, but there's people that you're able to reach by speaking about this that other people can't reach. You have your own people that need your voice. And so I
Yeah.
think it's wonderful that you're raising awareness about this. So
Thank you.
tell us how people can get in contact with you, and the resources that you have. Like, share with us how people can get their hands on that workbook and the book that you have and all the things.
Well, so first of all, I created a YouTube channel, The Journey Sage, primarily answering the questions that I get the most. What's an MDMA journey like? What the heck are intentions? What's this integration thing and how does that work? And what exactly is reframing? I did like longer form 5 to 7-ish minutes videos on YouTube to kind of create a repository to answer the questions that I get the most. So that's freely available for everybody. I have at my website, thejourneysage.com, a sample prompt. It's actually the body prompt. It's the prompt I use the most when crafting intentions, and that's fully available on my website for a download. I also have a couple of chapters. I wrote the memoir and the workbook to basically showcase what this therapy is, how it worked for me. I clearly have a child abuse focus because that was my experience, but I do know that I've spoken to lots of veterans and kind of how they feel with their PTSD, and it's fundamentally a lack of control. That's the foundation of it. So I think my story can also help folks who have had a traumatic event in some way. So basically, thejourneysage.com is my website. That's where you've got the resources. The Journey Sage YouTube is where I answer a lot of these questions. The books are available out on Amazon. And I do have a scheduling tool on my website because people kind of they want to just verify some information or get some more information. So folks can chat with me directly if they'd like.
That's awesome. That's so awesome, especially on this type of research that's really new. I'm sure people have a ton of questions. So we will direct
Yeah.
everybody to, in the show notes, people will have access to your website and to your YouTube channel and all the
Cool.
places to find you. But I wanted you to say it here too for those that are just listening. But Jill has some amazing resources. So I would encourage you, if this is something you're interested in, something you think that could help you, like, reach out, find the resources, figure out what you can be doing right now to prepare for, when this is released. And it's a journey. It's always a journey that we have to go through. And it's not overnight, but life is a journey, right? It's ups and downs and all the things. So we just want to encourage you to find the thing that works for you and to not be so judgmental for the things that maybe work for someone else. That whether that be MDMA therapy or, I've talked to other guests who, use marijuana therapy, like all different things,
Yep.
different types of
Yeah.
modalities. And, you know, we're all different. We're all different. So what works for one may not work for all. But
Yeah.
I would definitely encourage people to research this. So with that being said,
Yeah.
Jill, do you have, like, what would you like to leave our audience with? Any closing thoughts or remarks?
Well, Amber, I want to thank you for this opportunity to share my story and share this healing modality and get the word out about psychedelic use for mental health. I think the U.S. is on the right track. I wish it would move a little faster, but I always want things done yesterday. And I just encourage folks who are struggling or who know someone who is struggling to, yes, go to maps.org, start looking at the books that talk about this healing modality. Don't believe the Facebook post from the person down the street versus a PhD. That's really where we need to start understanding what works, what doesn't, and look at the clinical research. And, people like me who have gone through the therapy and tell you the good, bad, and ugly about it. And with that, just keep an open mind, and hopefully more and more people will get healed as we move further along.
Yeah. Wow. That is so awesome. And I just want to thank you so much because you're obviously very knowledgeable. You have your own personal experience, but you have a lot of knowledge behind this as
Yeah.
well. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us and spending this time to educate my audience and, just sharing your heart and your story. It really means a lot. So thank you so much, Jill.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure chatting today. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Through the Trauma podcast. If you have found value in this episode or believe in the mission behind what we are doing, please subscribe so that you never miss any future episodes. Also, be sure to check out our transformation project at transformationthroughtraumaproject.com, where we help inspirational stories get heard on a larger scale through multiple platforms. If you know someone who can benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Until next time.